Hello again, Nick Leifker here, and welcome to Operations Management. So far in this introduction, we've talked about why we study operations, why we need to take operations, we need some ideas to how we create value, we need to manage the creation of that value. And we also talked about this idea of goods and services, what's the difference between the two, and why services we need to have some understanding of, but also we need to understand that there's some differences involved between that and our typical physical good. Well, to round out our introduction of operations, what we're going to do is we're going to look at its history. We're going to look at how operations management has developed over the centuries. So, where does operations management begin? Well, operations management predates humanity. If you look at some of our nearest neighbors in the evolutionary scale, you'll note that some of them can actually develop and create tools. Well, that's production. That's, strange as it sounds, operations. You see, that's the beginning of operations. What you would call craft production. Taking and developing simple objects, creating simple objects, simple tools. So, craft production is just one skilled person, one skilled individual, using simple tools to produce simple goods, small quantities of goods. That said, let's think about this, okay? We create goods on our own. Tends to be slow, tends to be inefficient, tends to be costly. It is the beginning. So it's going to be inefficient. It's going to be slow. It's also going to be difficult to repair. The reason why is because each item is a unique handcrafted part. The result is that if something breaks, then some other unique handcrafted part is going to be needed to fix it. So, this is the beginning. This is just one person working by themselves, creating fairly simple objects by themselves using simple tools. And this is the good old days. I don't mean to denigrate handcrafted parts. I, build stuff myself. But compared to our modern operations, it's fairly simple and it is inefficient. So, around the 1700s, things started to develop. Things started to change. People started thinking about the work they did. And more to the point, how to improve it. For instance, Eli Whitney. He came up with this idea of interchangeable parts. As I mentioned before, up until that time, any item that was built was created was an individual handcrafted part. Therefore, to fix it, you needed an individual handcrafted part. Whitney's brilliance was to ask, what if we made the same parts the same way every time? And thus, all it would take to repair an item that had broken was take out the broken part, put in the new part, and it's fixed. Simple, beautiful. So suddenly repairs became a lot easier. Now the other idea that came from this time was this idea of division of labor, and what Adam Smith did. Adam Smith is father of economics, pioneered the study of economics, but he also studied how people performed work. And what he did is he looked at the craft of needle making. I know that may sound almost ludicrous nowadays, but back then, excuse me, back then, to make needles was a craft. And there were about 10 different steps involved with it. You'd have one step where you'd have to manufacture the eye. You'd have one step where you drew out the wire. You'd have one step where you'd cut the wire. You'd have one step where you'd fashion the tip, the needle point of it. You'd have one step where you'd affix the eye to the needle and shaft. You'd have all of these different steps involved with making a needle. And there were about 10 steps. And a good needle craftsperson could make about 10 needles a day. Yes, I realize that sounds absurd nowadays, but that's the rate at which people could make needles back then. What Smith did is he took an expert at each step. Someone who was an expert at making the eye, someone who was an expert at drawing the wire and cutting the wire, someone who was an expert at fashioning the tip. And he got an expert for each step and had them just work on that one step. That's division of labor. And by having 10 people working on each step, all of a sudden, those 10 people could make 1,000 needles a day, which is a 10-fold increase in what each person could do individually. So, the idea of division of labor, you put an expert at each station, at each step in a process. And by having an expert at each step in the process, that process is able to go much, much faster. So, in the early 20th century, things started to develop a little further. For instance, you had human factors. And the idea of human factors is this. Is the movement that you perform in a job, does it contribute to the job? Effectively, does it add value? So, what the Gilbreths did was they studied how people move while they were getting work done. And what they would do is they would eliminate movement that was not necessary to the production of the job. So if you had for instance, if you had to walk 10 feet to pick up a tool and then go back to your station, that was inefficient. That was waste. So why not just have the tool right there available so that you could use it? So what the Gilberts did is they pioneered this idea of human factors, that the movements that we make, the stuff we do to get a job done, needs to add value to the job. And then there's this idea of mass production. I mentioned before division of labor. What mass production does is it takes that division of labor to its extreme. By dividing the work up into such small pieces, and then giving each worker just that small piece, suddenly you don't need experts, because by having just this tiny piece of work for each person to do, they very quickly become an expert at that tiny piece of the process. So, because of this, you don't need skilled workers, and more to the point, you can manufacture high volumes of goods very quickly. And that's what Henry Ford contributed, this idea of mass production, this idea of the assembly line. Now, to understand the developments that came about as a result of World War II, some background information is needed. Armies need equipment to continue running. They need food, they need weaponry and the various implements that go into that weaponry. They need clothing, they need places to, they need tents, they need places to sleep. There's all sorts of material that is needed in order for an army to go out in the field, and in order for an army to continue operating. At Valley Forge, General George Washington was told repeatedly by his soldiers, no food, no soldier. After all, they were starving at Valley Forge, and it was very true that if they did not continue to be fed, the Revolutionary Army at that point may disintegrate. That was a very real possibility at the time. A couple of decades after that, Napoleon Bonaparte was famous for saying, "An army marches on its stomach." What he meant by that is that it is food that fuels an army. In other words, if an army is not well fed, it will shut down. It will break down. So, in many cases, in warfare, victory or defeat has hinged on whether or not an army could continue to supply its troops. So, by extension, a nation must use its resources wisely and efficiently in order to succeed in warfare. So, what did the US government do? Well, they did a couple of things. The first thing that they came up with is this idea of statistical sampling. When a soldier goes out to fight, they want to be sure that their equipment works. After all, a gun that doesn't shoot isn't going to help anybody on the battlefield. So, how do you make sure that the equipment that soldiers use in the field will actually work properly once it gets there? Well, Bell Labs came up with this idea of statistical sampling, taking a small sample of completed goods and testing them just to make sure that they work. So you take that small sample, see if they work, and if they don't work, figure out why they don't work so that you can fix those problems, so that those errors don't occur in the future. That way you can be absolutely sure that whatever goes out in the field, whatever equipment goes out in the field, that it is going to function properly. Now, as I mentioned before, an army marches on its stomach. So, how do you make sure that you're able to feed that army using a minimum amount of resources? Well, this is what's known as a linear program. In other words, you have something you want to minimize or maximize. In this case, you want to minimize the cost of feeding a soldier under a set of constraints. In this case, it's constraints of goods that you can purchase or develop. You have nutritional constraints, how much a soldier needs in a day, in terms of nutritional value. And this was the problem that was given to George Danzig. How do you feed a soldier using the smallest possible cost? Well, what Danzig came up with was a generic method to solve a linear program, a method known as the simplex method. So the idea is that by using the simplex method, a person is able to figure out the best decision for a given situation, the decision that will provide the smallest cost while still satisfying all of the proper conditions necessary. In this case, minimizing the cost to feed a soldier while still making sure that all of their nutritional needs are met. This is important because, well, in a business environment, you have to make decisions that will hopefully maximize your profit. So, under that circumstance, you're going to have constraints. You're going to have constraints as to the money you have. You're going to have constraints as to the amount of raw materials you can get, the amount of labor that you'll have available. So, how do you maximize your profit under this circumstances? That is linear programming. Now, some operations management courses teach linear programming. There was actually significant movement to just teach nothing but linear programming. That's how much this technique was beloved by operations instructors. I really don't go into it all that much. If you were to take 410, we would go into it in a little more detail. However, it's important that you know the concept, the idea of making the best possible decision given a set of constraints. That said, there's a lot of tools that automate such decisions. So we really don't go into all that much detail here. So, after the war, well, we won. And in many ways, we suffered the curse of winning. We got complacent. After all, we won World War II. We were the superpower. And the only country that could really compete with us really didn't want to compete with us in terms of capitalism. Their philosophy was somewhat different. So we got complacent. What ended up happening was American companies thought they were the best in the world, and so they got a little lackadaisical with regard to quality. We developed all of these experts with regard to quality, but we really didn't have a place for them. After all, we were selling cars left, right, and center. Who was going to compete with us? Well, we eventually found out. You see, while American manufacturers were continuing on thinking that they were best in the world, other countries were improving and finding a better way to build these goods. For instance, you had the first major pioneers of quality, guys by the name of Deming, like Ishikawa. The idea here is that you develop a process that finds and eliminates waste, that removes sources of variation, sources of error, and gets rid of them from the process. So, all of a sudden, as the 50s and 60s developed to the 70s, people started realizing that this foreign competition was developing some very good, high-quality products. And it took a long time for America to catch up. To give you an idea, when my dad graduated from college, he graduated as an industrial engineer. He interviewed with one of the big three automakers at the time. And they told him that they designed their vehicles that they were selling to break down after 50,000 miles. Now, think about that. You buy a car, and it is designed to break down after 50,000 miles. It is designed to fail after 50,000 miles. So, you have one culture that is deliberately sabotaging their quality. And then you have another culture that is developing and improving their quality. Well, what do you think is going to happen in the long run? As it happened, all of a sudden, people realized that the goods that were coming out of Japan were of much greater quality than what was coming out of Detroit. And, well, we all see where Detroit is nowadays. So, by the 1980s, American industry had figured out that it had messed up. Significantly messed up. So, how do you improve? How do you get better? Well, one of the lessons that came about as a result of this was that competition had become global. It was no longer just about our company. So, how do you improve things? How do you make your company better? How do you make your company viable? Well, several things came about. The first is this idea of e-business, this idea of e-commerce. One of the things that we're going to study toward the very end of the course is that when human beings make decisions, they tend to do so strangely. Oddly, in fact. Put simply, people make decisions with their own biases involved. And some of these produce some strange results. So, what happens if you take the human aspect out of it? You let computers handle and coordinate business transactions. Well, you find that a lot of the quirks, a lot of the oddities that come from business transactions tends to be reduced by taking the human factor out of it. Then there's this idea of outsourcing. Now, with outsourcing, well, it's got somewhat of a bad rap because people have lost jobs because of outsourcing. That said, in some cases, that's the only way for that business to continue operating, and that is figure out what you're good at, figure out what you're not good at, and whatever you're not good at, pay someone else to do. That way you focus on, well, the term is core competencies. You focus on what makes your company great, and you don't focus on things that you're not so concerned about, things that you don't do so well. Now, you have to be careful about outsourcing and how you do it. After all, if you outsource something that is proprietary, that can lead to some problems in the marketplace. Suddenly, every secret that you're using to cement your position in the marketplace is known to everyone else. So you have to be careful about what you outsource. But in many cases, outsourcing what you don't do well, that will tend to save money in the long run. Again, you have to be careful about how you do it. But if you take what you don't do well and let some other company that is good at doing that take care of that, in general, that will produce savings in the long run. You just have to be careful about how it's done. Now, with this last one, with supply chain management, by the 1980s, companies started figuring out that they could get everything with their business running smoothly, running beautifully, but it could all be sabotaged if they had a problem with their supplier or if they had a problem with their customer. So suddenly this idea of supply chain management came into being. That it's not just enough for us to get our business in order. That we had to make sure that our relationship with our suppliers was well maintained, was well managed, and that our relationship with our customers was well maintained and well managed. So supply chain management is how we do that, how we manage those relationships. And this is where we really start seeing the modern picture of operations. Operations is not just one person, it's not just one company. There is an interconnectedness to operations management, an interrelatedness to operations management. And we're going to see that expand even further. So, finally we get to the future in many ways. You see, we started off with one person working by themselves. Then we came to a group of people working by themselves, to how a company gets its processes done right. And then with supply chain management, they realized it wasn't just about their company, but about who they did business with, about their suppliers, and about their customers. Well, it turns out that when it comes to operations, it's not just about who we do business with. It's about the entire environment that we do business in. Put simply, we have to make sure that we're good neighbors. For lack of a better way of putting it, we have to make sure that we are good neighbors, that the places that we call home, the places where we do business, that we don't irreparably harm them. To give you an idea, there is a place out in Niagara Falls, a neighborhood known as Love Canal. In the 1920s, this was the home to a chemical company. And this chemical company dumped all sorts of toxic waste into that particular area. Now keep in mind, this was early 20th century. The people really weren't thinking about environmentalism at the time. And so they had all of this toxic waste at this location. Well, after the plant closed, they decided that they'd just keep it as a toxic waste dump. There was just one odd situation. And to understand what goes on stretches the boundaries of common sense. The Niagara Falls School District decided that they wanted that land to build a school on. After all, it was land. And it was land that hopefully they could get cheap. So the chemical company that owned the land, initially they said no, it's a toxic waste dump. And the school board said, well, we still want it. So the chemical company sold the land to the school board for $1 and all liability for that land. With the complete knowledge that it's a toxic waste dump. They were honest about what was going on. Well, there's just one problem with this. First, it's a toxic waste dump, and it's a school on a toxic waste dump. But what tends to happen around schools? People build homes around schools. People build communities around schools. So, a community ended up being built on this toxic waste dump. Yeah. Eventually, the place was closed down, and massive environmental cleanup was required. It was one of the worst ecological disasters in American history. But it points out the problem of sustainability. Companies have to have practices that have a minimal effect on the world around them, on the ecology around them. Now, it's not to say that they should be so concerned about this that they can't make a profit. But you do have to be careful. You do have to have some judgment, some standards when it comes to what you do to the environment. You have to understand that it's not just you. It's not just your company. That you operate in a world, and that you have to be a good neighbor. Another example of that is ethics. You have to make sure that, as a good neighbor, that your business meets a certain standard of behavior. Now, you have to be very careful about this, because every company has an ethical statement. However, you also have to make sure that your business processes, that your business practices reflect that standard of behavior. You have to make sure that ultimately you live up to that standard of behavior. I got my MBA from Texas A&M and went there from 2002 to 2004 for my MBA. This was less than 100 miles from Houston, and it was in the immediate aftermath of the Enron scandal. Yeah, ethics matter. I then went to work in the retail energy industry for a year as an analyst. Most of my colleagues had Enron on their resumes. Most of them lost their retirements because Enron executives decided to hide the truth about the health of the company from its own employees. Yeah. What you do, you have to be a good neighbor. You have to meet a certain ethical standard. The world has a surplus of dishonest business people. Well, now you know why I treat cheating the way I do if I catch it. Because poor ethics, a lack of ethics, is a detriment to business. In closing, and I am sorry that it's taken so long. I normally like to keep these to about 20 minutes, but we see that there's a theme with regard to operations. This expansion in how we view operations. It started initially with one person, with one single entity by themselves, working by themselves on their own. What am I doing? Well, eventually that expanded. It expanded to several people working together. What are my friends and I doing? So it expanded to a group of people. And then it expanded even further. It expanded to customers and suppliers. What do our customers want? What do our suppliers want? How do we make sure that our suppliers meet a certain standard from us? And then, ultimately, with operations, we're seeing that it comes to this view that everyone is important. That it's not just us. It's not just who we do business with. but it's with the environment, the business environment, and the physical environment that we operate in. Everyone is important to our business. Now, we still want to make a profit. After all, that's what we're here for. To take inputs and make them of greater value. But we're taking a longer view, a broader view as to what that profit is. Now, our next lecture will start on forecasting, and so we'll really start to get into the meat of the course, so to speak. Until then, be well and take care.